For a long period, the Indian subcontinent was governed by Britain. Today, the same broad region contains three independent countries: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. To understand how that transformation took place, we need to begin with the arrival and expansion of European colonial powers in India. European colonization began with the Portuguese in 1505. Over time, several European empires established small trading settlements around the subcontinent. Most of these outposts disappeared fairly quickly, and only the French, Portuguese, and British possessions survived into the 20th century. A map of India during this period would show a handful of small Portuguese territories along the western coast, together with one tiny French possession on the eastern coast. Almost everything else was under British control. Britain's expansion began with a commercial organization known as the East India Company. The name reflected an older European habit of calling the Americas the West Indies, so the lands and trade routes further east became associated with the East Indies. In its earliest form, the company's colonies were not large provinces. They were trading forts, usually surrounded by a little farmland and a few additional buildings. These settlements had three basic purposes. They could purchase local goods for export, provide food and supplies for English merchant ships, and act as a diplomatic post or embassy. At first, that was more or less the extent of their role, but communication with Britain was painfully slow. Sending a message to a colony and receiving a reply could take years, making it completely impractical for the government in Britain to manage every decision from home. Because of that difficulty, the British government granted the company remarkable powers. It was allowed to declare war, recruit its own army, and build a navy of its own. These forces were supposed to protect the company's trading routes and defend its settlements. In practice, they also enabled the company to fight rival European empires and wage war against local populations. Even so, conquering large parts of Asia was not normally a realistic undertaking for a European power during the early period of colonization. It is easy to imagine fleets of enormous wooden warships crossing the oceans with thousands of soldiers aboard, but that picture mostly comes from two different situations: warships operating close to Europe, or the much later wars of independence in the Americas. European warships generally stayed relatively near home waters and borders. They also had limited room for provisions. A ship designed for battle needed space for cannon, ammunition, and other military equipment, leaving little capacity to carry enough food and supplies for a huge force on a long voyage across the ocean. When European armies were transported to the Americas in very large numbers, that happened much later, during the American War of Independence in the late 18th century, and during the wars in Spanish America in the early 19th century. Until roughly the middle of the 18th century, therefore, the British possessions in Asia were small. They were closer in size to minor states than to a country-sized empire. And even if Britain had somehow been able to send a major army to India, it would have faced an immensely powerful state. At that time, most of the subcontinent was controlled by the Mughal Empire. The Mughal state was one of the great powers of the world. India accounted for about 27% of the entire global economy, and the Mughal Empire controlled most of that wealth. That share was comparable to the whole economy of China or to the combined economy of Western Europe. This was not a weak or undeveloped region waiting to be taken. The empire possessed a major shipbuilding sector, a powerful textile industry, and an active, prosperous network of trade. In short, a European empire could not simply invade and conquer the Mughal Empire. The balance of power made such an operation impossible. That situation began to change during the early 18th century, when the Mughal state entered a slow and serious decline. The empire came under pressure from outside. Persia and Afghanistan invaded, placing additional strain on the central government. At the same time, regions within the empire increasingly demanded greater autonomy. The Mughal authorities were unable to deal with the internal and external pressures simultaneously. As its control weakened, the empire gradually broke apart. The first territories to separate were found around the edges of the Mughal realm. This was especially important for Britain because the East India Company already had its settlements on those very outskirts. The company did not need to conquer the entire Mughal Empire in one direct assault. Instead, it was positioned close to the regions that were becoming independent and beginning to compete with one another. The company quickly recognized the collapse of Mughal authority as an opportunity to make even more money. Once the empire began to fracture, neighboring regions often went to war. In other cases, rival groups fought over who would inherit a throne or become the next ruler of a particular state. These succession conflicts gave the British an opening. The East India Company would support one side, usually in a dispute over succession. Its forces had better artillery and more effective warships than those available to many of the Indian states. That advantage could help the company's chosen candidate win the struggle and take the throne. But military assistance came with a price. After helping a claimant secure power, the company installed one of its own representatives inside the new government. This representative was placed in charge of the state treasury. In effect, the company gained control over tax collection and over decisions about how the state's money would be spent. Controlling the treasury meant controlling the government itself. The company could determine which programs received funding and which plans were impossible to carry out. It could influence what the state was permitted to do without having to govern every part of the country directly. Naturally, a substantial portion of the taxes collected in this way went straight to the East India Company. The money was then sent to London, where it was distributed to the company's shareholders. If a newly installed ruler objected to this arrangement, the company had another form of persuasion. Its warships could appear outside the state's ports and threaten to bombard or destroy them. The British could then remove the uncooperative ruler and replace him with someone more willing to accept the company's demands. The East India Company still lacked the ability to move enormous armies across the ocean. It could not transport vast numbers of British troops in the way that later imperial powers would. However, it could bring ships armed with larger and more advanced cannon than those possessed by many Indian rulers. That naval superiority was enough to make the threat credible, especially for states whose wealth and trade depended on their ports. Using this combination of military support, financial control, and naval intimidation, the company negotiated further agreements with Indian princes. Each agreement transferred another part of a state's authority to the East India Company. These arrangements became known as unequal treaties because the two sides did not receive comparable benefits. In exchange for allowing the company to interfere in their affairs, the local rulers gained little or nothing of equal value. By 1765, the company had even reached an agreement with the Mughal emperor himself. Under the treaty, it obtained the right to administer the finances of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Within only 10 years, the British had become a major force in those parts of India. They had achieved this not by conquering the whole subcontinent in a single campaign, but by exploiting political conflict and placing themselves in control of the money that kept local governments functioning. The company's rise also had the support of the British government. A number of senior government officials owned shares in the East India Company. That created a direct personal interest in the company's success. Laws and policies were passed that strengthened the organization, allowing it to gain more power and, as a result, increasing the wealth of the officials who invested in it. Not all of the company's income was immediately sent to its shareholders. Some of the taxes taken from the Indian population were reinvested in the process of expansion. The company used that money to recruit Indian mercenaries and train Indian soldiers to fight on its behalf. Over the following decades, these forces helped it conquer more and more territory. A map showing the company's advance would reveal its gradual progression across India. The East India Company eventually ruled an entire empire, with a governor based in London overseeing Indian trade, taxation, and administration. Yet British control did not look exactly the same everywhere. Some areas were governed directly by British officials. Other territories remained under the authority of Indian princes. These states became known as the princely states. Their rulers were allowed to retain their titles and continue governing their lands, but only under British conditions. Each prince had to pay a specified sum to the company. In return, he was permitted to remain in charge of that particular territory. In practice, the company had created a system that resembled bribery on an enormous scale. A prince who paid enough could continue to be a prince. The arrangement preserved the appearance of local independence while ensuring that the real balance of power favored the East India Company. The rulers kept their palaces and titles, but the company gained their money and restricted their choices. As time went on, the burden placed on the population grew heavier. Indian taxes were raised and Indian land was seized. Entire areas were converted into opium plantations. The opium was needed for trade with China, where it was exchanged in order to obtain tea. India was therefore turned into a vast center of opium production designed to support Britain's wider commercial system. The British also damaged much of India's existing industry. Indian steel, shipbuilding, and textile producers faced steeply increased taxes on their goods. British products, however, were not subjected to the same level of taxation. This created a market in which Indian manufacturers had to pay more, while British manufacturers could sell more cheaply. As a result, it became less expensive to import an item from Britain than to purchase a similar item made in India. Indian businesses could not compete under those conditions, and many of them went bankrupt. Industries that had once supported a prosperous economy were weakened or destroyed, while the subcontinent was pushed into the role of a source of raw materials and a market for British products. India's share of the world economy fell from 27% to only 2% under British rule. At the same time, Britain began selling its own manufactured goods to millions of Indian consumers. This helped British industry expand far more rapidly than the industries of other European countries. In India, British producers faced little meaningful competition, and they had access to more than 100 million potential customers. As increasing amounts of India's wealth resentment spread among Indians, even some British officials began acknowledging what was happening. One administrator wrote in 1857 that the central policy of the English had been to place the entire Indian nation beneath British interests in every possible way. The people were taxed as heavily as the authorities could manage, and every province brought under British control was turned into an opportunity to demand still more revenue. British officials even took pride in boasting that they had extracted far more money than the rulers who had governed those regions before them ever managed to collect. That pressure helped produce the Indian Rebellion of 1857. More than 800,000 Indians died in the attempt to free themselves from the East India Company. The scale of the uprising persuaded the British government that it could no longer leave the administration of India in the company's hands, so the government stepped in and assumed direct control. Yet the arrangement was hardly a clean break with the past. The British government agreed to pay the East India Company a yearly sum in exchange for the right to govern India. Since many people in the British government also owned shares in the company, the deal effectively allowed them to make an agreement with themselves and use public authority to provide themselves with even more money. When direct rule began in 1858, the British kept much of the company's machinery in place. The main alteration was that the governor was no longer appointed by the company's shareholders. He was now appointed in the name of the British Queen. The shareholders were replaced by members of Parliament, although many of those parliamentarians already held shares in the company. In practical terms, therefore, the change was not as dramatic as it might have appeared. The greatest difficulty facing the British was India's enormous population. Britain itself was a relatively small country, and it simply could not create an army large enough to control the whole of India by force. By 1890, only about 6,000 British officials were responsible for governing the country. They were supported by approximately 70,000 European soldiers and another 230,000 Indian soldiers whose wages were paid from Indian taxes. All of them were expected to rule a population of more than 200 million people. At any given moment, the British made up no more than roughly half of 1% of India's population. That left their position extremely vulnerable. If the people of British India ever managed to unite behind a common cause, the British would probably be defeated. Their answer was to prevent that unity from developing and, wherever possible, to encourage Indians to turn against one another. Hindus and Muslims had lived alongside each other for centuries, but British policy increasingly treated them as separate and opposing communities. The authorities began dividing Hindu and Muslim areas and creating conditions in which the two groups would have to compete. Food and land were not provided in sufficient quantities, leaving communities to fight over whatever remained. Existing political structures were then dismantled and replaced with systems organized around religious identity. By ensuring that Hindus and Muslims were represented and governed separately, the British made future disputes easier to provoke. The more frequently the two communities quarreled, the less capable they became of acting together. That, in turn, made it easier for the British to preserve their authority. The divisions were not simply allowed to emerge on their own, they were useful to the colonial government. One way of making Muslims appear especially threatening to Hindus was to give them a disproportionate presence in the British Indian Army. Muslims formed about half of that army, even though they represented only around 20% of the population. To Hindu observers, this could make Muslims seem like a heavily armed and highly militarized group, although the arrangement had been created by the British themselves. At the same time, British officials promoted the idea that India had historically been a Hindu land and that it therefore ought to belong to Hindus. Muslims were portrayed as outsiders who had invaded and occupied Indian territory. The contradiction was obvious. The British were themselves foreign invaders occupying the lands of both communities. Nevertheless, this version of history helped direct Indian anger away from British rule and towards other Indians. The colonial authorities also worked to prevent either side from developing strong, independent leadership. Indians were routinely denied promotion within the army and the government. When an Indian and a British person held equivalent posts, the Indian was paid less, and Indians were often placed under the command of British officials who were less capable than they were. In this way, talented Indians were kept from gaining influence, while British authority remained above them. Those Indians who were permitted to enter the higher levels of government had usually been thoroughly anglicized. They had studied in Britain, adopted a British way of life, and increasingly thought of themselves as British. Many came from wealthy Indian families or from elite groups descended from people who had supported the colonization of the country. In return for their loyalty, those families were given the opportunity to send their children to British schools, which were regarded at the time as some of the finest in the world. Education became another route by which members of the Indian elite were reshaped in Britain's image. One British viceroy described the arrangement by saying that they were all British gentlemen engaged in the magnificent task of governing an inferior race. The wording reveals the attitude behind the system. The British did not see themselves as temporary administrators sharing power with Indians. They regarded themselves as members of a superior ruling class, while the people they governed were treated as incapable of managing their own country. After returning to British India, these anglicized Indians could be admitted to an institution known as the Indian Civil Service. It was modeled on the British civil service and was responsible for much of the everyday machinery of government. Its members could serve as mayors, tax collectors, secretaries, and administrators in posts that were not filled directly by the British government. In theory, this created an Indian administrative class. In practice, Indians remained a tiny minority within it. Only about 4% of the Indian civil service was Indian, while 96% consisted of English people. India's first prime minister later mocked the organization by saying that it was neither Indian, nor civil, nor a service. The description captured the reality that the institution was designed primarily to preserve British authority rather than to prepare Indians for self-government. The British members of the service were not necessarily effective administrators either. Each official could be assigned dozens of different responsibilities. The work was arranged in such a way that no individual had enough time to complete all of those tasks properly, and in many cases, there were not enough resources to deal with the problems in front of them. Yet when an official's performance was assessed, the main question was not whether the population had been governed well. The important measure was how much tax revenue the official had managed to collect. That created a powerful incentive to ignore almost everything except taxation. An administrator could spend little time on the welfare of local people, neglect development, and fail to prepare for food shortages, yet still advance if money continued to flow into the treasury. The safest path to promotion was to extract as much revenue as possible and leave the local population to deal with the consequences. The authorities did not establish a serious plan to prevent famines. They did not prioritize development. Their central purpose was the removal of wealth from India. British officials serving in India were even paid more than officials working in England, despite having fewer duties to complete effectively. One account describes a district officer who was only 24 years old. He had no real knowledge of the people he was meant to govern, understood little about the land, and had no practical experience. Even so, he was assigned dozens of separate responsibilities. The full list was extensive, but the basic problem was clear. Even if he had genuinely wanted to perform every one of those jobs, he would not have had the time or the resources to do so. What mattered in the end was that he sent money back to London. Once the system was judged by the amount of revenue it produced, the condition of the people became secondary. The official success was measured by the money extracted from the district, not by whether its schools improved, its roads were maintained, its administration became fairer, or its inhabitants were protected during hardship. As more and more wealth was drawn out of India, British attitudes towards the country became increasingly possessive. India came to be celebrated as Britain's most valuable possession, the so-called crown jewel of the empire. The Queen of England was also proclaimed Empress of India, turning imperial rule into a grand public symbol. The title suggested that India was not merely a territory under occupation, but the central ornament of the British imperial system. To mark that grandeur, the British established a new capital at New Delhi. In 1911, a British king traveled to India and was crowned emperor there. The ceremony displayed the power and wealth of the empire, but the performance of majesty did not stop with official events. It spread into the clothing, jewelry, entertainments, and hobbies associated with elite society. Indian elites were expected to buy and wear expensive British goods and to take part in British-approved forms of leisure if they wished to be regarded as worthy of speaking to British officials. The products and services required for this performance of status were, naturally, sold by British businesses. Anyone who wanted access to the upper levels of government therefore had to pay an unofficial additional charge. It was an unspoken tax on proximity to power. Indians funded the very culture that marked them as subordinate. The arrangement enriched British merchants while humiliating Indian elites. They had to imitate British manners and purchase British goods in order to be treated as respectable, yet they were still denied equal standing. British officials expected Indians to adapt themselves to British standards, while refusing to show the same willingness to adapt to Indian customs. This separation continued even though generations of British administrators were born in India or spent most of their working lives there. They generally lived in isolated British towns or neighborhoods, apart from the wider population. Their children were sent to England for education, and after retirement, many of the officials returned to the British Isles. India might have been the place where they had worked for decades, but it was never regarded as their homeland. By the 19th century, India had already seen several rebellions against British rule. Every one of them had failed to free the country. Great Britain was the dominant world power, while the people of India lacked both a united movement and the leadership needed to organize a successful revolt. In response, a group of Indian elites began considering a different way to gain political and economic influence. Their plan was to establish an organization made up of Indian lawyers, members of the Indian civil service, and sympathetic British people. Together, they would speak on behalf of Indian rights and press the colonial authorities for change. In 1885, they founded the Indian National Congress, an organization that remains part of Indian political life to this day. At first, the Congress was not demanding independence from the British Empire. Its initial aim was more limited. Indians should have a greater share of power within the government of British India. The organization wanted Indian people to participate in decisions affecting their own country, even though India would still remain under British control. For more than 2 decades, Congress members spread their arguments through newspapers. By 1875, India already had 475 newspapers owned and written by Indians. The Congress built on that growing press. Its publications promoted Indian nationalism, drew attention to corruption within the British Indian government, and tried to create a shared identity among people living across the colony. The organization hoped that this public support would strengthen its appeal to the British authorities. It called for a more democratic political system that included Indians, pushed for laws protecting Indian rights, and sent representatives to communicate directly with the governor and the colonial administration. But the response from the British government was consistently dismissive. Requests to place more Indians in government were ignored. Proposed legislation intended to protect Indian people was ignored as well. Even the representatives sent to speak with the authorities were treated as though they had never been there. The British simply did not consider Indian demands important enough to answer. The reason was straightforward. British officials were judged largely by the amount of money they managed to send back to England, not by the satisfaction or welfare of the people under their rule. As long as Indians continued cooperating with the colonial system, there was no practical reason, from the British point of view, to listen to them. Instead, the authorities came to regard the Indian National Congress as an irritating nuisance and a possible source of rebellion. They began restricting the organization's ability to publish its views. Officially, the British Empire claimed to support freedom of speech in India, but in practice, that freedom extended only to speech approved by the government. This created a deeply contradictory situation. While the colonial authorities presented themselves as defenders of free expression while punishing Indians who actually exercised it. Newspapers and printing presses were frequently closed down, editors were prosecuted, and, in some cases, sentenced to hard labor. These measures continued for more than 20 years. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were Indians in their 20s who had spent their entire lives watching the Congress achieve almost nothing through petitions, speeches, newspapers, and appeals to the British government. The lesson seemed increasingly clear. Rebellion had failed, but negotiation had failed too. People who had grown angry and frustrated after 2 decades of fruitless efforts began searching for another method of attracting British attention. Their conclusion was logical. If the only thing the British government truly cared about was money, then the most effective response would be to make it difficult for Britain to earn money in India. Members of the Congress, therefore, began standing outside British-owned shops. They asked passers-by not to buy British goods and directed them instead towards Indian shops. Simply encouraging someone to enter a different shop was not, technically, a crime, yet the tactic had an economic effect. British business owners began losing income, and the authorities were unsure how to respond. The British were accustomed to dealing with armed violence, guerrilla warfare, and large-scale uprisings. They knew how to confront soldiers and rebels. They were far less prepared for people standing peacefully in the street and politely asking customers to shop somewhere else. For the first time, Indian activists were beginning to receive the attention of the British authorities. A new approach was taking shape. Resistance did not necessarily have to involve weapons or an open revolt. It could also threaten the financial foundations of colonial rule. In 1915, an Indian lawyer named Mohandas K. Gandhi returned to India. He had studied at University College London and had spent time in South Africa, where he campaigned for the rights of Indians living there. His experience in South Africa had made him an advocate of non-violent resistance. There, Gandhi and those supporting him had challenged segregation laws by refusing to cooperate with the authorities. They would not accept discriminatory rules, and they would continue withholding cooperation until their demands for greater rights were met. The campaign succeeded. Gandhi therefore came back to India with a reputation that made him a kind of hero to many Indians. He was a man who had stood up to the British and won. Gandhi soon joined the Indian National Congress and began supporting its campaign for Indian self-rule. At this stage, self-rule did not necessarily mean complete independence. The idea was that India would remain within the British Empire and continue under some degree of British oversight, while Indians themselves would manage most of the country's internal affairs. Gandhi also reached an important conclusion about the Congress. If it wanted to achieve self-rule, it could not remain an organization led mainly by educated elites speaking to one another. It needed the support of ordinary Indians. Until then, the Congress had largely been directed by lawyers, professionals, and other members of the Indian elite. They produced speeches and newspaper articles, often for an audience that was already politically engaged. But only around 10% of Indians could read and write. Newspapers could therefore reach only a small proportion of the population. Hundreds of millions of Indians remained largely untouched by the arguments being made in Congress meetings and printed publications. Many of those people had experienced the harshest consequences of British rule directly. Some had been driven from their land. Others had watched friends and relatives die from starvation. They had seen, and in many cases endured, the worst conditions the colonial system had to offer. Gandhi and other Congress leaders now began seeking their support, rather than assuming that political change could be achieved by educated Indians alone. The Congress started reaching across India's social divisions, communicating with people from different castes and classes, and from different parts of the country. Its members also looked beyond newspapers for ways to spread their ideas. They addressed large crowds, speaking directly to the public instead of relying only on printed arguments circulated among the educated. At the same time, Congress activists sent reports and articles to newspapers in England. Their hope was that British journalists would expose the abuses and violence committed in India. If these reports reached the British public, then no one in Britain could easily claim ignorance of what the colonial government was doing. Perhaps, in turn, a movement would develop in the United Kingdom in support of Indian Home Rule. This broader strategy found a particularly receptive audience because of the events between 1914 and 1918. During those years, the British Empire was fighting the First World War. More than 1 million Indians served in the British Army, stationed in different parts of the world, and fighting against German, Ottoman, and Austrian forces. The British had offered something in return for this service. They promised that India would receive home rule within the British Empire. Under such an arrangement, India would manage its own affairs in much the same way as Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, while remaining connected to the empire. But the promise was not genuine. The British government had no real intention of granting India self-government. Its immediate concern was avoiding an Indian revolution while the empire was already fighting a global war. British leaders therefore told Indian representatives whatever they believed would keep them calm and cooperative, intending to postpone the issue until the war had ended. The Congress, however, was not prepared to wait quietly. Its members felt that waiting for the end of the war was too slow, especially when the promised political change had never been sincerely offered. Indians began organizing enormous demonstrations involving millions of people. They refused to cooperate with British officials and openly disobeyed laws they considered unjust. The reasoning behind this campaign was that a few 100,000 soldiers could not imprison millions upon millions of Indians. Trying to suppress the entire population would be enormously expensive. If the cost of controlling India became greater than the money Britain could extract from it, then the colony would no longer be profitable. That was the objective: make India so expensive and difficult to operate that the British would eventually decide to leave. Eventually, the war ended. At that point, the process of transferring power to Indians should have begun. Instead, the British delayed. Then they delayed again. They postponed the promised reforms for so long that Indians came to understand what had happened. The promise of home rule had been a lie. The discovery produced deep resentment throughout British India. More than 1 million Indian soldiers had fought in the war. 84,000 of them never returned home, while another 64,000 came back wounded. India had paid a terrible human price for the British war effort, and the broken promise of self-government made those losses even more bitter. India had endured a famine that killed millions. Then, after 4 years of fighting in a British war, its people were rewarded with absolutely nothing. By 1919, anger had spread across the country, and Indians began to riot and demonstrate in cities and towns throughout British India. The shadow of Amritsar. On the 9th of April 1919, the British authorities arrested 2 nationalist leaders in the city of Amritsar. When local people heard what had happened, they poured into the streets to protest. The demonstrations soon turned into a riot, and 15 people were killed. In an attempt to restore order, the city authorities called on the British Army. 2 days later, on the 11th of April, General Reginald Dyer arrived with a body of troops. By the time Dyer reached Amritsar, the violence had already subsided. Even so, he issued a proclamation forbidding public gatherings of more than 3 people and banning protests anywhere in the city. 2 days after that, on the 13th of April, between 10 and 15,000 people gathered in Amritsar to celebrate Baisakhi, a spring festival. Many of them had come from outside the city, and they did not know about Dyer's order. When the general learned that a crowd had assembled, he marched his soldiers towards the festival. He made no serious attempt to discover why the people were there. He did not warn them that the gathering had been prohibited, and he did not try to arrest the organizers. Instead, he ordered his troops to fire directly into the crowd. The soldiers used around 1,650 rounds of ammunition. The exact number of deaths remains uncertain, but some estimates reach as high as 1,500. Ordinary civilians, attending a religious spring festival and unaware that they had broken any order, were shot without being told what they had supposedly done wrong. The massacre became known as the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. General Dyer was eventually forced to resign and return to England. Yet many people in Britain did not see him as a criminal. A conservative newspaper felt sympathy for him and organized a public donation campaign. In modern terms, the money raised would be worth roughly $1,600,000, and Dyer received it. The families of those who had been killed, by contrast, received only about $1,800 per family in today's money. The massacre became a powerful rallying cry throughout British India. More and more Indians began to question British rule openly. New protest organizations appeared, while the Indian National Congress attracted more supporters than ever before. Even Indians employed in the Indian civil service began challenging their superiors in public. Some of them joined the Congress themselves. At the same time, it was becoming impossible to ignore the fact that Britain had no intention of granting India the home rule it had promised. The Congress therefore abandoned its earlier demand for home rule and began calling instead for complete independence. In the aftermath of Amritsar, Indian politics moved into a new and more confrontational phase. In 1920, the Indian National Congress launched the non-cooperation movement. The basic idea was straightforward. The people of British India would simply stop helping the colonial system function. If the British ordered them to work, they would refuse. If the authorities arrested them, they would not assist with their own imprisonment. If the government passed a law they considered unjust, they would deliberately break it. The British had only a few 100,000 soldiers and police officers. They could not arrest millions upon millions of Indians if those people collectively refused to cooperate. The intention was, in effect, to make colonial rule as difficult and frustrating as possible without giving the authorities an easy excuse for even greater violence. Some of these methods later appeared in a manual produced by the Central Intelligence Agency called The Art of Simple Sabotage. For instance, if a British official asked a question, a protester might simply lie. If an officer asked for directions, he could be sent in the opposite direction from the one he actually wanted. If an Indian was forced to carry out a task, he might take as long as possible, add unnecessary stages to the procedure, and insist that every tiny, irrelevant detail had to be completed perfectly. The aim was to consume as much of the official's time as possible. It was rather like the person in a group project who contributes nothing useful, delays every decision, and makes a simple task needlessly complicated. Except here, the behavior was being used as a form of resistance against an occupying power. Over a period of 2 years, large sections of the population of British India refused to cooperate with the colonial administration. The British response was to arrest almost every important member of the Indian National Congress. The one major exception was Gandhi. The authorities hoped that, once the movement had been deprived of its leaders and its organizational structure, the uprising would collapse. They assumed that ordinary people would not know what to do without educated figures directing them. Popular movements, however, do not always depend on a small group of leaders in the way governments expect. The protests continued, and the British found themselves unsure how to respond. Up to this point, most revolutions in the colonies had been comparatively limited. The major exception was the American War of Independence, but Britain had never before faced resistance on this scale from a population as large as India's. There had certainly been enormous revolutions elsewhere, including the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, yet both had taken place in Europe. The British Indian administration held a deeply prejudiced belief that only Europeans possessed the education and intelligence required to organize such a movement. Its officials thought that if they arrested all the Indians who had received a British education, the revolution would simply run out of direction. What, they wondered, could the wider population do without its leaders? The answer was that the people of British India continued protesting anyway. Even with the senior figures of the Congress in prison, the movement carried on. Then, in one of the most dramatic turns in the history of the independence struggle, the revolution suddenly stopped. The turning point came at Chowdi Chowda. A police station was set on fire, and several people inside died. Gandhi was horrified by what had happened. He concluded that he had moved too quickly in encouraging the struggle for independence without placing enough emphasis on the absolute importance of nonviolence. He decided that the Indian people were not yet ready for independence. In his view, they needed further preparation before they could govern themselves without the movement descending into the kind of violence seen at Chauri Chaura. At that moment, most of the other leaders of the Indian National Congress were still in British prisons, leaving Gandhi as the movement's de facto leader. He therefore called off the revolution. In 1922, Gandhi brought the Indian Revolution to an end and turned his attention towards building the kind of India he believed would be ready for independence. A new beginning. With independence no longer considered achievable in the immediate future, the Indian National Congress began moving back towards the idea of India becoming a dominion. Britain had failed to grant dominion status after the First World War, despite earlier promises. The Congress now hoped that demonstrating the damage Indian non-cooperation could inflict would eventually force the British to give way. If the authorities refused, Indians would simply begin protesting again. It was a very slow struggle. At first, the British once again made promises about dominion status, while having no genuine intention of handing over meaningful power within the empire. The Indians responded as they had said they would. They resumed their protests. There were many major campaigns and mass demonstrations, but one of the best known was the Salt March. In British India, the colonial government controlled both the production and the sale of salt. Salt is not a luxury. Without it, the human body eventually becomes fatally ill. By controlling access to this essential substance, the British could raise large amounts of revenue and place additional pressure on the population by restricting one of the basic nutrients people needed to survive. There was, however, a serious weakness in this system. Salt was extremely easy to produce. Anyone with access to seawater could evaporate it and collect the crystals. The government might claim a legal monopoly, but it could not make the physical process of producing salt complicated. That made salt an ideal target for civil disobedience. Gandhi began his march across India on the 12th of March 1930. He continued until the 6th of April, walking approximately 390 kilometers, or around 240 miles. It was an extraordinary journey for a man who was 60 years old. As he traveled, increasing numbers of Indians joined him. When the marchers reached the coast, Gandhi made salt in defiance of the British regulations. He then continued along the shoreline, moving from one town to another and from one city to the next. Everywhere he went, he produced salt and encouraged other people to do the same. The action was deliberately simple and highly visible. Indians were reclaiming something the colonial government insisted it alone had the right to control. Before long, hundreds of thousands of people across the Indian coastline were making, buying, and selling salt. Once again, a few thousand British officials and soldiers could not control millions of Indians who refused to cooperate. By openly producing and trading salt, the population began breaking yet another pillar of British authority. Protests of this kind eventually persuaded the British to offer a limited measure of self-government, largely because they wanted to bring the costly unrest to an end. In 1935, they introduced home rule for roughly 10% of the population of British India. Even then, however, the British had a carefully designed political plan. They intended to hold elections in which Hindus and Muslims would vote separately, with members of each religious community choosing representatives only from their own community. The hope was that this system would prevent the two groups from working together. The British then went further. They publicly favored the Muslim political organization known as the Muslim League. Their aim was to encourage Hindus to believe that they were being treated unfairly, despite being the majority population. This policy was strongly opposed by both Hindus and Muslims. Eventually, pressure from both sides forced the British to allow voters to choose any representative they wished, rather than restricting them to candidates from their own religious group. Nevertheless, the British had already succeeded in driving the two communities further apart. Hindus and Muslims increasingly viewed one another with suspicion. In Indian politics, they were repeatedly placed on opposite sides, partly because they were the only two Indian political organizations with enough influence to challenge the authorities. From this division came a new and increasingly serious question. Perhaps independence should not be declared by a single united country. Perhaps there should be two countries instead, Pakistan for Muslims and India for Hindus. Muslims began asking themselves whether they would rather become a minority inside an independent India or form the majority in an independent Pakistan. In 1937, these fears and ambitions became visible in an election. The Indian National Congress won 617 of the 739 general seats it contested. It also won 25 of the 59 seats reserved exclusively for Muslims. There were approximately 15.5 million voters, drawn from a total population of more than 300 million. Although an election had taken place, most of the real authority still rested with the British Indian government. That government was increasingly worried by the popularity of the Indian National Congress. Officials in India were instructed by London to obstruct the organization whenever possible, and above all, to weaken the movement for Indian independence. This instruction soon became much harder to carry out. Only 2 years later, in 1939, the British Empire entered the Second World War, and the conflict initially went badly for the British. As part of the empire, British India was brought into the war as well. The elected Indian leaders were not consulted before that decision was made. Technically, they could have refused to take part. In practice, the Indian leadership was prepared to support the war. They believed that the actions of Germany were far worse than those of the British, and they were therefore willing to fight in Britain's defense. They wanted one thing in return: home rule. The British, however, still refused to make that concession. The Indian National Congress responded by launching the Quit India movement. Its demand was straightforward: either grant India home rule or remove India from the war. If India was going to be sent into a conflict, the movement argued, that decision should be made by Indians themselves. Demonstrations spread across the country. But with the war hanging over them, the British authorities responded with overwhelming force. They broke up the protests, closed Indian newspapers, and imprisoned the entire leadership of the Indian National Congress. As the years passed, the Quit India movement lost momentum and achieved relatively little. Its suppression nevertheless gave the British another opportunity to deepen the divisions within Indian politics and weaken Congress still further. The leaders of Congress had been arrested, and the organization was largely Hindu in its membership and support. The Muslim League, by contrast, was not subjected to the same mass arrests. The British used this difference to give the League greater political influence, while encouraging Hindus to feel that they were facing a growing threat from Muslims. Members of the Muslim League were allowed to take up government positions, and they were given greater freedom to organize and address public meetings. The purpose was to widen the gap between Hindus and Muslims once more. The British hoped that, if the Muslim League came to dominate the independence movement, Hindus would turn against it. A divided population, they believed, would be less capable of uniting behind a successful demand for independence. These political freedoms brought a rapid expansion in the League's membership. It grew from 112,000 members in 1941 to more than 2 million by 1944. The British hoped that this vast increase would lead to serious conflict between Muslims and Hindus. Their government largely held the view that the native population was barbarous and could not become civilized without British supervision. That assumption proved to be wrong. Rather than using its new influence simply to provoke attacks on Hindus, the Muslim League began campaigning for an independent Pakistan. Its demand did create resentment among some non-Muslims, but not enough to draw the rest of the country away from the struggle for independence. When the Second World War ended, the leaders of the Indian National Congress were released from prison. The British wanted to discredit Congress as much as possible, so they announced elections only a few months later. Congress was still trying to reorganize its leadership and rebuild its political machinery. The Muslim League, meanwhile, had gained considerable influence during the years when Congress had been suppressed. As a result, Congress found it extremely difficult to persuade Muslims to vote for its candidates. The election therefore divided largely along religious lines, precisely the outcome the British had hoped to create. Most Muslim voters supported the Muslim League, while most Hindu voters backed the Indian National Congress. The League won such strong support among Muslim voters that its leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, declared that he spoke for the majority of Muslims in British India. In his view, Those Muslims had clearly expressed their wish for an independent Pakistan. Congress, on the other hand, continued to argue that the people of India should declare independence together and create a single, united Indian nation. The disagreement produced intense friction between the Hindu and Muslim populations. In a united India, Muslims would become a minority, and many feared that British oppression would simply be replaced by domination from the Hindu majority. The anxiety was not confined to political speeches. There were mutinies in the army, partly driven by fears that one religious community would control the other. Hindus and Muslims clashed during rallies calling for independence, and even some police officers openly took sides. This left the British as the only force that appeared capable of keeping order, exactly the situation they had wanted to create. Yet as civil unrest spread, other countries were also beginning to compete for influence in India. China, Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and the United States all regarded India as a possible ally in the future. At the same time, Britain was still recovering from the enormous cost of the Second World War. It could not easily hold back all four foreign powers at once. British officials also feared that they might soon have to confront a communist revolution in India supported by the Soviet Union. In response, they devised an entirely new strategy for controlling the country. The British still believed that the native population was incapable of governing itself. Their plan was now to withdraw from India, perhaps leaving a small number of troops behind. Once independence had been granted, they expected the country to collapse into civil war. The British could then return, restore order, and present themselves as the only form of government India could realistically depend upon. In February of 1946, the British government finally agreed to sit down with Indian representatives and discuss the eventual transfer of power. The negotiations were exceptionally difficult. By this stage, the British mainly wanted to leave India because governing the country had become such a heavy burden. The Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, however, still could not agree on the terms by which independence should be achieved. To address these disputes, a government was formed that included the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, and the negotiations continued from there. After almost 200 years of policies that had encouraged ethnic divisions, the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress could no longer reach a firm agreement about the future of their countries. Both organizations were under intense pressure from the communities they represented. Hindu leaders feared that they might surrender too much authority to Muslims, while Muslim leaders faced the same concern in reverse. Neither side wanted to appear weak, and every stage of the negotiations became more difficult. Outside the negotiating rooms, the violence continued. Riots spread, and thousands of people were killed. British soldiers and police were often present, yet they stood aside rather than intervening effectively. The situation began to look less like a political dispute and more like the approach of a full civil war. That was precisely what the British government wanted to avoid. Britain had no desire to remain responsible for a conflict of this scale, especially while it was still struggling with the consequences of the Second World War. The British therefore set a firm deadline for independence, June of 1948. The Congress and the Muslim League were now forced to settle their differences quickly. Their proposed compromise was that India and Pakistan would first become two separate independent countries while continuing to negotiate afterwards. In theory, the two new states might eventually reunite under a new united government. Looking at the map of South Asia today, however, it is clear that this plan never came to anything. That agreement created an even more difficult question: which areas would belong to Pakistan and which would become India? The Muslim League argued that territories with a Muslim majority should form Pakistan. On the surface, this appeared to offer a simple solution, but India was not divided into neat religious blocks. Hindus and Muslims had lived beside one another for generations. Applying the principle of religious majorities would therefore leave very large Hindu communities inside Pakistan and very large Muslim communities inside India. The result would be one of the biggest forced migrations in modern history. Before independence, somewhere between 14 and 18 million people would move across the new frontier, traveling from one country to the other in search of safety. The journey was dangerous, and roughly 1 million people would die during the upheaval. Families were separated, homes were abandoned, and communities that had existed for centuries were suddenly told that they belonged on the wrong side of a border. The regions of Punjab and Bengal made the problem even harder. Both contained substantial Hindu and Muslim populations, but neither had a clear majority belonging to only one religion. They were therefore divided as well. One part of Punjab became Indian and the other part became Pakistani. Bengal was split in the same way. A line on a map cut through towns, villages, farms, roads, railway connections, and trading networks. People who had lived alongside each other for generations found their local economies broken apart, causing damage that would continue long after the partition itself. There was another geographical complication. The areas in which Muslims formed a majority lay at opposite ends of the subcontinent. The western section became West Pakistan, while the eastern section became East Pakistan. India stood between them, meaning that Pakistan would consist of two territories separated by another independent country. The new government would have to administer both regions at once, despite the enormous distance between them. At first, the Muslim League suggested creating a free trade union between Pakistan and India. Goods could then move across the intervening territory, allowing East and West Pakistan to maintain their economic connection. India considered this arrangement impractical and rejected it. The next suggestion was a corridor running through Indian territory, linking the two Pakistani regions directly. India did not want its country cut in half by a Pakistani passage, nor did it believe that it could afford to guard such a long and vulnerable frontier with such a limited economy. In the end, East and West Pakistan remained separate from one another in every practical sense, despite belonging to the same country. Their political, cultural, and economic tensions continued to grow. Eventually, the division led to a civil war between Pakistan and the Eastern Territory. India supported the eastern side, and in 1971, Bangladesh defeated Pakistan and became independent. The later conflict is not the main focus here, but it demonstrated how unstable the original arrangement had been. There was still one more major problem. The British did not directly govern every part of British India. Alongside the territories ruled by the colonial administration were hundreds of princely states, each governed by its own prince. The exact number is usually given as 565. These rulers possessed varying degrees of authority, and nobody was certain what their constitutional position would be once British rule ended. The British produced what seemed at first like a remarkably simple solution. Every princely state could become an independent country. In practice, that would have transformed the entire Indian subcontinent into a vast patchwork of tiny states. Each might have been drawn into the influence of Britain, China, the Soviet Union, or some other outside power. Instead of two large successor states, South Asia could have become a tangled web of competing territories. The result would have been chaos, utter chaos. Alarmed by this possibility, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League began negotiating with the princes. Fortunately, most of the rulers were troubled by the same prospect. They understood that isolated independence would leave them weak and exposed, surrounded by much larger neighbors. Almost all of them eventually chose to join either India or Pakistan when independence arrived. Their decision prevented the subcontinent from breaking into hundreds of miniature countries and came as a huge relief to the main political leaders. A few rulers, however, still wanted complete independence. 4 of the most important princely states were Hyderabad, Kashmir, Bhopal, and Travancore. These were among the largest states in British India, so their choices carried much greater weight than those of a small principality. India and Pakistan both pressured them to join one side or the other. The rulers appealed to Britain for assistance, but the British government was determined to withdraw from the entire situation as quickly as possible. Britain also lacked the resources to provide meaningful protection or political support. The country was still recovering from the Second World War and was trying to preserve what remained of its wider empire. It could not afford to become entangled in a new series of disputes across the subcontinent. The 4 princely states were therefore gradually forced to choose between India and Pakistan. None was allowed to remain independent for very long. As the new governments took responsibility for administration, the old princes slowly lost their political power. Most eventually retired into obscurity, while several attempted to enter electoral politics and succeeded in winning elections. Their former domains were absorbed into the developing states of India and Pakistan, and the princely system steadily disappeared. The rulers might retain their titles for a time, but real authority now belonged to the governments that had inherited British India. By 1947, the violence between Hindus and Muslims had reached a terrifying level. Food supplies were disrupted, mass killings took place, and thousands of houses were burned. The leaders of the communities in British India wanted to deal with the crisis themselves. They believed that, even if British officials meant well, local leaders understood the situation better and were more capable of managing it. Ordinary people, meanwhile, had largely reached a different conclusion. They simply wanted the British to leave. With Britain eager to withdraw and the partition plan already prepared, the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, and the British government brought the date of independence forward. Instead of waiting until June of 1948, they agreed that power would be transferred on the 15th of August, 1947. The decision was made under immense pressure, and hardly anyone was satisfied with the arrangement. Nevertheless, it was the agreement that the three sides could finally accept, and they hoped it would prevent the religious conflict from developing into an even wider civil war. The intention was that both India and Pakistan would be secular states. Citizens of every religion would be free to live there, regardless of whether they were Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, or belonged to another faith. Muhammad Ali Jinnah expressed this principle by saying that a person might belong to any religion, caste, or creed, and that such matters had nothing to do with the business of the state. Whether that ideal could survive the violence of partition was another question, but it was presented as the basis on which the two new countries would be built. Independence also threatened Britain's economic and diplomatic position. Once India and Pakistan became sovereign countries, trade between them and the British Empire would naturally decline. Britain therefore needed a new relationship with its former colonies, one that could preserve cooperation without relying on direct rule. The answer was a new organization called the Commonwealth of Nations. In straightforward terms, the Commonwealth was a group of countries that had once been part of the British Empire. Today, it includes 56 nations and acts, in some ways, like an international association for its members. Its countries may take part in trade agreements, diplomatic initiatives, and other forms of cooperation, but membership does not impose the same strict obligations as belonging to a political union. Countries can participate in particular arrangements without being required to accept every one of them. The organization originally existed to encourage cooperation among the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. At that stage, those countries were semi-independent rather than fully detached from Britain. The inclusion of India and Pakistan changed the nature of the organization. It would now contain independent former colonies, as well as countries that still maintained constitutional links with the British Crown. This arrangement allowed the people of British India to see the British depart as friends, while preserving many of their existing trade and diplomatic connections. It was a way of maintaining useful relationships without restoring colonial rule. India and Pakistan, however, did not agree to recognize the British monarch as their own king in the way that Australia or Canada did. They would remain members of the Commonwealth while becoming republics in their own right. On Friday, the 15th of August, 1947, the British flag was lowered. The new flags of India and Pakistan were raised in its place. Independence did not immediately settle the status of every territory in the region. Several areas joined the new states only later. Junagadh and Hyderabad were annexed by India in 1948. Kalat was annexed by Pakistan in the same year. Gwadar became part of Pakistan in 1958, while Sikkim merged with India in 1975. Kashmir followed a different path. It became a disputed territory claimed by India, Pakistan, and China. The region was divided between them, and that division remains in place today. Even the official end of British rule had therefore failed to establish a final settlement across the whole of the former empire. Two smaller colonial possessions also remained to be dealt with, the territories still controlled by France and Portugal. At the beginning, it was mentioned that Britain, Portugal, and France all possessed colonies in India. So far, though, the focus has been on the British territories. What then became of the French and Portuguese possessions? For the most part, the independence movement did not seriously disrupt them. France chose to negotiate with the newly independent Indian government, agreeing simply to transfer its very small Indian colonies to India. Portugal, however, took a very different approach. Indian independence was only the first stage in the wider collapse of the European empires. After India became independent, much of Asia and Africa followed, as one territory after another declared its freedom from European rule. As these empires continued to lose their colonies, Portugal's dictator became determined to retain the Portuguese possessions for as long as possible. He wanted Portugal to be the last remaining European colonial empire. India initially tried to bring the Portuguese territories under its control through diplomacy. The Portuguese dictator refused, however, and would not agree to hand them over. India then began supporting resistance groups that favored union with India. After more than 2 weeks of fighting, these forces took control of Dadra and Nagar Haveli in 1954. That left only Portugal's largest colony on the Indian subcontinent, Goa. Goa was too important to be taken through a small pro-Indian resistance movement, so a direct invasion would be required. On the 17th of December 1961, India launched its attack. The Portuguese forces were overwhelmingly outmatched, with Indian troops outnumbering them by 13-1. Portugal had only 4 ships, whereas India could deploy 16. India also had 44 aircraft, along with large numbers of tanks and armored vehicles. Everyone in the Portuguese government understood that Portugal could not win a war against India. Even so, the dictator instructed the Portuguese general to resist until the last man. The general did not follow that order. After just 2 days of fighting, with more than 50 people dead on both sides and Portuguese forces completely surrounded, he surrendered. On the 19th of December 1961, Goa was formally annexed by India. Portugal and India remained rivals until the Portuguese dictatorship finally ended in 1974. In Portugal, virtually nobody saw any real purpose in continuing a war with India, and only 8 months later, the two countries signed a peace treaty. At the end of that year, India and Pakistan came to independence from the British Empire.